Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute of History, johnjdwyer.com, me, Gwen Falconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwood's Stores, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with our Will Rogers Medallion-winning author-historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. It's Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history by the names we remember. John J. Dwyer, Quanah Parker, a leader in war and peace? What's this story?
Yes, Gwen, this time we're going to remember one of the mightiest leaders in both of those, war and peace, that Oklahoma has ever known. And we're going to remember how close our history is to us in Oklahoma. Those of you listening right now, you, Gwen, and me. Quanah Parker was the greatest of all Comanche leaders. He was born in the Wichita Mountains near the present-day southwest Oklahoma town of Cache in 1848, nearly a generation before the war between the states. He died in 1911 amidst a new world replete with Ford Model T automobiles, airplanes, telephones, of which he owned one of the first in western Oklahoma, and silent motion pictures, the first of which he appeared in. And remarkably, one of his great-grandsons, Quanah Cox, was one of my junior high football and basketball coaches in Duncan. Coach Cox had an entire room in his home dedicated to his great-grandfather. And I grew up with two of Quanah Parker's great-granddaughters, and I'm friends with them still. In fact, they allowed me the privilege of speaking to the Quanah Parker family reunion in Duncan a few years ago, where the legendary chief's direct descendants had gathered from across America and other countries as well. And as we suggest in the climactic pages of our book, The Oklahomans, Volume 1, Quanah arises as perhaps the quintessential archetype of the bridge from the Old West to the new in Oklahoma, even as both he and the West retained so much of their essential strength and so many of their distinctives. Quanah Parker was born into the most fearsome warrior tribe ever to rumble across the earth. The Comanches stopped the Spanish, the French, the Mexicans, the Apaches, and numerous other tribes, and for a long time, the Americans, from conquering the Southwest. His father, Peyton Nakona, was a legendary war chief, and his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, an even more famous white woman. A member of one of the great Texas pioneer dynasties, she was captured by the Comanches in a bloody raid as a child, and then recaptured 25 years later by Texas Rangers in a battle in which Quanah's father likely fell in a shootout with future Texas Governor Lawrence Sullivan Sul Ross. The Quahati band of Comanches that Quanah grew up to lead from an early age was the only North American tribal group never to sign a treaty. The loss of both his parents, his mourning mother starved herself to death in captivity, his siblings, close friends, and at least one of his 7 wives at the hands of the Texans and other Americans kindled a volcanic hate within him. Through his mid-20s, he rose to become perhaps the greatest native war captain in American history. Tall and muscular, athletic and brilliant, for years he outfoxed, outfought, and frustrated adversaries of every order, including a multitude of other tribes, the Mexican Army and the United States Army. He himself killed Americans, Mexicans, and natives from other tribes, and participated in or led many raids and slaughters that involved robbery, rape, torture, and murder. The Comanches' victims included women, children, and even babies. These events stretched across vast tracts of land and many years. The Quahatis were the final native group to surrender on the southern plains, and they did so in 1875 only when they were nearing starvation and relentlessly pursued by the greatest Indian fighter in American history and the greatest soldier in the Old West, the dauntless Colonel Ranald Slidell MacKenzie. While U.S. Army commander at Fort Sill in present-day southwest Oklahoma, Civil War hero MacKenzie dispatched Comanche and white peace emissaries to persuade Quanah and his few holdouts to come in to the fort. lay down their arms and take up peaceable ways as American citizens. Surprisingly, those ambassadors found Quanah at this point ready to surrender, and also urging his handful of fellow remaining Quahatis to do so. Upon getting to know Quanah, against whom Mackenzie had directly fought in numerous shootouts and battles across the plains of Texas and modern-day Oklahoma, he recognized in the fabled warrior a strength of character that spurred him to mentor the Comanche, teach him American social manners and customs, and guide him toward leadership opportunities among both native and white societies. Mackenzie also persuaded Quanah's socially and politically prominent white Texas relatives to look past his bloody deeds and accept him. Indeed, his mother's Parker forefathers founded the first Protestant church in Texas. Talk about a heritage. Well, after shielding the final Quahati resistors from imprisonment in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Quanah capitalized on Mackenzie's trust and influence. He also recognized the peaceful path of American citizenship as the best hope for his decimated tribe. For it's important to remember, Gwen, that no more than 3,000 Comanches remained alive at the time of their final surrender to Mackenzie. As chronicled by author S.C. Gwynn in his landmark work, Empire of the Summer Moon, Quanah shrewdly embraced and led them toward farming and ranching, attending American schools, getting involved in commercial business enterprises, participating in the civic arena, and learning the English language. Eventually, he founded an American-style school district for Comanche children that was owned and run by the tribe, and he served as its school board president. He also cultivated relationships with white leaders on the local, territorial, state, and national levels. During the 1880s, Quanah parlayed his innate entrepreneurial and interpersonal skills and his burgeoning friendships with white cattlemen and business leaders into a large ranch and a lucrative Comanche land leasing business. He even charged his white colleagues fees for grazing and driving their cattle herds across the tribal reservation. As his influence grew, some of those same friends sponsored him on trips to Washington, D.C. There, this former intrepid enemy of the United States advocated these and other enterprises that he believed were in the tribe's best interests before high federal officials, including President Theodore Roosevelt. He and Roosevelt developed a lasting friendship, as evinced by their famous 1905 wolf hunt near Frederick, Oklahoma Territory, in present-day Tillman County, and Quanah's riding in Roosevelt's presidential inaugural parade. According to author Gwynn, Quanah also influenced his tribe to get away from the pagan ghost dance cult that led the Sioux tribe to disaster at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. Well, even greater feats by Comanche and Oklahoman Quanah Parker lay ahead, as we'll discuss after the break.
This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we learn. Quanah Parker, obviously a leader in war, but now a leader in peace. John J. Dwyer?
Quanah Parker was the greatest of all Comanche leaders. He also defended his tribe as he verbally dueled with government commissioners, leading the Dawes Act process of wresting Plains Indian lands away for individual allotments to tribal members and sale of the remainder to settlers, particularly regarding the large Big Pasture region in southern Oklahoma Territory. This enabled the Comanche to lease that 500,000-acre area for grazing for scores of thousands of dollars annually for years. By the time all the land was allotted, Quanah had personally secured better terms and more money for the tribe. And in 1890, Quanah accomplished two of his greatest feats. The U.S. government named him the first and only principal chief in Comanche history, a high station to which the tribe itself later re-elected him. He also built the Star House, a 2-story, 10-room mansion near the Wichitas. It was a dwelling of which the wealthiest Oklahoma or Texas cattle baron would have been proud. White and Indian guests alike filled the Star House's dining room with its 12-foot ceiling. Many of them were well-known figures in American history books, including General Nelson Miles, Apache Chief Geronimo, Kiowa Chief Lone Wolf, Texas Ranger and pioneer Charles Goodnight, and Quanah's friend, President Theodore Roosevelt. His generous nature had drawn the loyalty of others that grew more evident as he aged. He spent most of the small fortune he'd accumulated feeding the hungry who streamed to him and the Star House. Author S.C. Gwynn poignantly wrote how teepees often clustered around Quanah's Star House, even though he filled it with guests. And he and other family members slept outside in those teepees himself. The legendary enemy and killer of Americans, Mexicans, and other tribes had 2 white sons-in-law and adopted and raised 2 other white boys. Quanah retained a durable streak of independence through all of this, as reflected in his multiple wives, in which he sired 24 children, his leadership in the peyote-based Native American religion, and his long coldness toward the Christian faith. Yet after his pride and joy, gifted eldest son Harold fell gravely ill with tuberculosis in the mid to late 1890s. He witnessed young German-born Mennonite missionary Henry Colfell's evangelistic message to his son. When Harold professed belief in Jesus Christ to the Mennonite, the great chief Quanah Parker declared, quote, I see now what I never could understand or grasp before, end quote. Harold soon died, but according to Quanah, his son spoke frequently and trustingly in his final days about the scriptural teachings that Colfell had shared with him, and he died happy that he had found God's love. Hall of Fame Oklahoma historian Marvin E. Croker recounted what happened after Harold's burial, and I quote now, Quanah asked the people to go back into the Mennonite chapel. He stepped behind the pulpit, took the Bible in his hand, and addressed his fellow Comanches. He'd been to Washington many times, he stated, and had met presidents and senators, but never had he heard anything as comforting or inspiring as what he heard from the Bible and, quote, this dear missionary today, end quote. He urged his people to come to the mission every Sunday and listen to God's word. Here was the way to the heavenly home. Harold had told him he loved Jesus and wanted to go home, and God had granted his wish. Then Quanah said a prayer and departed. And that's the end of Dr. Marvin Croker's quote. Well, Quanah was now the one person with the power to keep Christian ministers from building churches on Comanche land or even preaching the Christian gospel to the tribe. But he was also the only individual with the power to give that permission, which he did in 1896 to the persistent Mennonite missionary Colfell, and thus began the conversion of the greatest warrior tribe in history to Christianity through the denomination most committed to being peacemakers in the history of the American church. And thus also was born Post Oak, the first Mennonite mission in history to a foreign land, the Comanche Reservation. Post Oak Mennonite Church continues to serve the Comanche people to this day, not far from Quanah's birthplace. Whether or not Quanah Parker himself trusted in Christ for eternal salvation is known only to God. Following the loss of his son Harold, he periodically attended Mennonite church services. At one point, the wealthiest native in North America, Quanah died nearly broke due to his ceaseless and selfless sharing of his possessions with others, usually those of various races who had nothing with which to pay him back. He could not bear to see anyone hungry, and according to White Cache, Oklahoma storekeeper Robert Thomas, he was always kind, never speaking ill of anyone. In closing, author Gwynn recounted how in the final months of his life, accompanied by his 12-year-old son Gussie, Quanah spoke to an enormous crowd at the Texas State Fair in Dallas. In memorably unpredictable Quanah Parker fashion, he sported a war bonnet, buckskins, and moccasins, yet what he said was this: I used to be a bad man. Now I am a citizen of the United States. I pay taxes same as you people do. We are the same people.
Quanah Parker. Now that's Oklahoma Gold. Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute of History, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Falconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwood's Stores, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with our Will Rogers Medallion-winning author-historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. It's Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the names we learn. The greatest soldier of the Old West, John J. Dwyer, who's this?
Well, Gwen, last time we explored the saga of the incomparable Comanche chief and Oklahoman Quanah Parker. This time we get to know the man who finally defeated him. And no, it wasn't George Custer, the only Old West soldier whose name remains somewhat widely known among the 21st century American public. Ranald Slidell MacKenzie was just as courageous as Custer, infinitely humbler, and even harder worker, and the man who won against all the toughest indigenous tribes on both the northern and southern plains. Before any of that, however, MacKenzie had already carved out a spectacular record of battlefield accomplishment. A United States Military Academy graduate who finished first in his class at West Point and one of the youngest Union generals of the Civil War, he was wounded 6 times, but promoted even more often, 7, rising from second lieutenant to brevet or wartime major general at only 24 years of age. By the end of the war, he was successfully leading an entire corps of troops in the conflict's greatest late battles. Ulysses S. Grant, commanding general of the Union Army and future president of the United States, declared MacKenzie the most promising young officer in the entire United States Army. Following that, his electrifying campaigns against ferocious Kickapoo natives, then raiding American settlements from Mexico, further elevated MacKenzie's towering reputation. Perhaps as great an accomplishment as these feats, Gwen, was his success in organizing, leading, and developing the soldiering prowess of the post-Civil War black regiments that he commanded mostly out of Fort Sill, near present-day Lawton. These were the soldiers whom the Plains Indians christened the Buffalo Soldiers. The natives claimed that with their curly, dust-coated black hair, the so-called Negro Cavalry resembled the rugged bison with which they shared the plains. Previous white officers failed to understand, connect with, or even want to with these rugged black troopers. MacKenzie, in contrast, saw them as men wearing the blue coat of his country, and he believed in them as much as he did in his white soldiers. Thus, they served and fought better for him than for any other commander before or after him. His unusually humane view of people of all races, for a high officer of that era especially, and shouldering immense responsibility in the cauldron of total war on the fearsome southern plains, extended to the natives he was tasked to fight in a war to the finish. Unlike other American officers, MacKenzie had no tolerance for the slaughter of indigenous women and children. This was particularly notable amongst the Southern Plains theater of the post-war between the states Indian Wars. These wars were a late 19th century fight between civilizations for the land and resources of Midwest and Southwest America. Tens of millions of acres of land lay unoccupied during this period due to the native tribes' tiny populations and their failure to develop their resources and draw in more people. Meanwhile, millions of American, European, and other migrants clamored for land and were willing to develop it, raise large families on it, and build communities, states, and a massive nation on it. The tribes were also unable to control a growing legion of outlaws that threatened to transform Indian territory into outlaw territory. In addition, the tribes engaged in ceaseless and brutal warfare with one another. The violent final act of the Southern Plains Indian War opened in June 1874 at Adobe Walls, a remote buffalo hunters' outpost in the Texas Panhandle. The destruction of up to 40 million buffalo was a strategic plan of war by the U.S. government in order to cripple the Comanches, Cheyennes, and other nomadic warrior tribes who drew their clothing, fuel, weaponry, food, and sometimes even water from the American bison. These tribes stood violently in the way of the settlement of the western half of America. But Quanah Parker, now the greatest, most respected of all Plains tribes chieftains, saw adobe walls as the embodiment of all that was destroying his people's way of life. He led hundreds of the toughest Plains warriors against the outpost. Stunningly, however, they were decimated by the tough Sharps 50 caliber buffalo gun-wielding frontiersmen, which included the famous later lawman Bat Masterson. The rage this thrashing fueled in Quanah, who himself was wounded in the battle, and the warrior factions among the Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho was terrifying. For months, they attacked white settlers, soldiery, and nearly anyone else they encountered in all directions across Colorado, Kansas, modern-day Oklahoma, and Texas. The horrors they inflicted were indicative of what renowned author S.C. Gwynn called, quote, the demonic immorality, end quote, of the pre-Christian Comanches. This quote, from nearly 40 years before adobe walls, recounted the tribe's common cruelty. One by one, Gwynn wrote, children and young women were pegged out naked beside the campfire. They were skinned, sliced, and horribly mutilated, and finally burned alive by vengeful women determined to wring the last shriek and convulsion from their agonized bodies. 16-year-old Matilda Lockhart's 6-year-old sister was among these unfortunates who died screaming under the high plains moon, end quote. Matilda, a Texas teenager, was herself repeatedly raped and had her own nose burned off by the Comanches. Now, in 1874, at long last, the U.S. government, corporate America, and the American people alike, clear to the Atlantic Ocean, had reached their breaking point. President U.S. Grant himself unleashed the armed might of the nation's western armies against the remaining hostile Southern Plains Indians in what history calls the Red River War. This epic confrontation proved to be the single most climactic campaign in the United States, winning the American West. It took place over many months, from summer 1874 through April 1875, across tens of thousands of square miles and with thousands of combatants. When it concluded, no doubt remained as to which civilization ruled by its might of armed power the Southern Plains and most of the American Southwest. Here is how the United States Army did it. 5 columns of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, totaling 3,000 men, converged on western Indian Territory and the Texas Panhandle to clean out renegade Quahati Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and any other natives who remained armed and in the field. They rode out from forts in 4 different states and territories. The Army and the indigenous warriors fought at least 14 and as many as 20 battles during the Red River War. Well-mounted, well-armed, well-supplied, and well-taught from their many past fights with the Plains tribes, the Army roamed in on them from all sides, careful to leave no path of escape. The climactic shootout took place in late September in the sprawling Palo Duro, second largest canyon in North America, near present-day Amarillo in the Texas Panhandle. There, the soldiers cornered the vanguard of Quahati, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Kiowa, who had stockpiled massive food and supplies to bivouac for the winter. And we'll discuss this historic showdown and what followed after the break.
This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history when you learn what actually happened. John J. Dwyer, how does someone measure the greatest soldier of the Old West?
Well, this is a tough story, Gwen, no doubt. And we are discussing Colonel Ranald Slidell MacKenzie, who commanded the key American column in the climactic battle of the crucial 1870s Red River War, the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle. He electrifyingly eluded indigenous scouts through a gut-wrenching 12-hour night ride. Three Fingers Jack McKenzie, for Confederate shrapnel took off 2 of his fingers at the Siege of Petersburg, did not arrive at Palo Duro unprepared or by chance. For years, his scarred body in constant pain, including from a 7th wound, a Comanche arrow in his thigh. He had learned his foes' tactics, their routes and cycles of travel, their preferred redoubts, even their watering holes. He had winnowed down their manpower during a host of skirmishes and battles, including a stunning 1872 ambush of them at the Battle of the North Fork of Red River. To draw upon the words of Comanche chronicler S.C. Gwynn, MacKenzie had largely brought about the tribe's reckoning at Palo Duro, quote, by daring to go where white men had not gone, by using his Indian scouts well, and those scouts, by the way, included Tonkawas and black Seminoles, as well as Mexicans and U.S. cavalry, all fighting with the U.S. Army against the Comanches and Southern Plains tribes. And then by attacking in force the moment he had intelligence of the camp, and he attacked with fury, end quote. MacKenzie got nearly all of his 600-strong force, leading their horses down a single narrow buffalo trail to the canyon floor before Comanche Chief Red Warbonnet spotted them. But a Tonkawa sharpshooter quickly killed Red Warbonnet. MacKenzie himself rode hell for leather at the head of his troopers as they thundered through the sprawling miles-long camp of teepees and routed their foe. Even now, though, they exercised restraint in their humane treatment of indigenous women, children, and elderly. The natives eventually scrambled up the canyon walls, then surrounded the troopers from above. Nearly 1,000 feet high, they showered rifle fire down on the Bluecoats. He then led his men straight for the Indians in an awe-inspiring rush back up the canyon walls and drove them into open country, now on foot. The troopers, led by the Black Buffalo soldiers, destroyed 1,400 Indian ponies, took scores of non-combatants back to native reservations in Indian Territory, and set about tracking down the scattered warrior survivors. MacKenzie was appointed commander of Fort Sill as the Red River War wound down. There, the Plains tribes he had long fought all gained respect for his tough but fair ways as they attempted to adjust to their new life on Southwest Oklahoma reservations. The peaceful emissaries whom MacKenzie wisely sent to Quanah Parker finally persuaded the legendary warrior and his remaining Quahatis relentlessly hunted to lay down their arms and come in to Fort Sill. After they did, Quanah himself credited MacKenzie with respecting and befriending him, providing him opportunities to rise as a leader in both the indigenous and white societies, and even teaching him American manners and social graces. After the massacre of General Custer and his 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Montana, the Army sent MacKenzie and his now elite 4th Cavalry north to deal with the unconquered coalition of Northern Cheyennes and Lakota Sioux who threatened American settlement across the northern plains. Within months, MacKenzie did what no other United States commander could. He defeated the Northern Cheyennes, forced Crazy Horse and the Lakota to surrender, and ended the Great Sioux War. MacKenzie thus led the U.S. Army to victory in the American West on both the northern and southern Great Plains. Always his objective was building an America where everyone could experience safety, respect, and opportunity. Sadly, though, Gwen, this golden nugget is a heart-wrenching one. Many possible factors contributed to a growing mental disorder, ultimately insanity, Gwen, that stole so much from MacKenzie he might have had. It stole the beautiful Texas ranch this native New Yorker had saved for years to buy. It stole the opportunity finally to enjoy the esteem of having twice helped save his country. And it stole from him marriage to the only woman he ever loved, San Antonio Belle, Florida Tunstall. A sought-after 18-year-old maiden when MacKenzie first met her, his shyness and near constant deployments likely contributed to her eventual marriage to a much older doctor. MacKenzie privately pined for the lovely Texan for 15 years, but finally, after her husband's death, MacKenzie and Florida set a date for their wedding just before Christmas 1883. The very night before the wedding, his mental problem exploded, triggering a series of events that would land him in an insane asylum in his native New York until his final year, when his sister Harriet attended him until he died at age 48. Those around him as he declined remembered him as very gentle and that children adored him. He never saw Florida again, and for the remaining 2/3 of a century that she lived, there is no record she ever again spoke the heroic name of the greatest soldier of the Old West, Ranald Slidell MacKenzie.
Now that's Oklahoma Gold.